Welcome to the Igniting Change podcast. My name is Duncan Cook, founder of Three-Sided Cube, trusted technology partner for some world-changing organizations. We know the power that technology has to have a positive impact on people's lives. But on this podcast, myself and my co-hosts Puff and Sophie are out to meet the people behind the technology, hear their stories and understand what drives them, and hopefully inspire others to join the mission and do some good in the world.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on this awesome episode of Igniting Change. Did you want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what organisation you're with?
Absolutely. My name is Sarah Berry and I am the Director of Marketing at Relate, a relationship support charity based in the UK.
Amazing. And how long have you been at Relate for, Sarah? Can you talk to us about how you've got to the position that you're in now?
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't actually been at Relate super long. I started there at the end of 2021, which actually is a few years ago now. I'm like, is it two and a bit years? And it's not a role. There are a lot of people that I work with at Relate who are like, this was always where I'm meant to be. And a lot of people who have worked there for 1, 2, 3, 4 decades. There's retention is not a problem that we have at Relate, generally speaking. But if you told me sort of, my child self 20 years ago that this is where I was going to be, I would not sort of believed you. You might be able to tell from my voice, but I am not from the UK. I was not born here. I am from Australia, in Sydney originally. I grew up in a place called the Central Coast, which is what I can see now is a beautiful coastal beachside surf town sort of city, sort of overflow from Sydney commuter belt kind of space, which at the time felt just like suburban hell, just absolutely nothing there for me. I grew up, I was lucky enough to have my mum staying at home with me for most of my childhood, and my dad was a golf pro. He was a professional golfer, taught golf on the very beach where Home and Away is filmed, for any Home and Away viewers that might be listening out there.
Oh my gosh, claim to fame. Did you
Exactly.
get to meet any of the cast or see any of the episodes being filmed?
Oh, absolutely. Many a time. A lot of the cast would often go into my dad's shop and buy an ice block or some crisps or something like that. And I would go in and help out in the shop occasionally. I'd be less of a help than a hindrance, really. But I'd get to see them then. I was always a bit of a neighbours girly though, so it was bit of conflict there. But sort of the charity world and the marketing sector and the UK, all of those things were sort of, not at all front of mind for me. But I think I always had a very strong sense of justice and right and wrong. I think I was always super opinionated, always incredibly stubborn, and just was very sure about what I would or wouldn't do in any sort of given situation. But I didn't really have a view as to what I wanted to do, other than when I was sort of like, 5, I was certain I wanted to be a professional bubble blower, which I thought was a real profession. And then in the CSI days, I wanted to be a forensic scientist, obviously. Who doesn't?
Yeah.
And then I got to high school and realized I was terrible at all of the sciences. So that sort of ruled that out for me. But it wasn't sort of until university that I sort of saw a picture of what I wanted to be. And all I knew, mostly from watching Gilmore Girls, was that I needed to find an internship, that was what you sort of had to do as your first marker. And one day I was in a political science lecture at university, and we had a guest lecturer come in who was a man named Sam McLean, who was a head of campaigns at an organization called Get Up. And he talked about how their organization was using the internet to make it easier for people to engage with their democracy. And they were one of those sort of what would now be referred to as sort of like a Slacktivist sort of email campaign organizations. But back then, in around 2010, was like really at the cutting edge of using technology for campaigning and for change. And Sam sort of said in his presentation they were always looking for interns and volunteers. And I thought, amazing, I'm going to get in touch. I'm going to go home tonight. I'm going to send an email and say that I want to volunteer for them. So I sent an email, said I wanted to volunteer, got an email back saying, great, come in and have a chat with us tomorrow. And walked in there and sort of sat down ready to be like, what do you need me to do? And hadn't quite realized that they thought I was coming in to interview for a very specific sort of internship position that they were offering. And I did not realize that that's what I was doing. I thought I was just coming in to just be like, I'll clean the office or like, do whatever it is that you need to do. So in the interview, I actually had to ask for a copy of the job description so I could have a look at that before we got started. I was absolutely mortified for my first interviewing. But for some stupid reason, they gave me the internship anyway, probably because back in 2010, most of these internships were unpaid. So they weren't really losing out on much. But I joined as a member services intern. So Get Up at the time had about 1 million people who were considered Get Up members that had been involved in some sort of one of their campaigns. And it was my responsibility to make sure that any of their questions, concerns, comments were read, responded to, and summarized for the broader team. And I just absolutely loved it. I just thought it was fantastic. And everyone who worked there for me was just so cool and just making such a difference. And I ended up interning there 1 day a week for a year. It was supposed to be a 3-month internship, but they couldn't get rid of me. And eventually I decided that I would sort of, that I needed to step away, and I I wasn't learning much more there anymore. And I got out for about 6 months, and then they got in touch saying that they had a paid donations assistant role available for 1 day a week, and would I be interested in coming and taking that on? And within a year, I was working full time, sort of running the member services department that I'd interned at previously. And the team of sort of 10 people that worked there when I sort of started ballooned, and I was there for about 5 years in the end. And by the time I left, I'd was leading their sort of social media campaigning and audience acquisition program, and it had expanded greatly to about 75 staff. We'd moved from a sort of rat-infested sort of old factory on the outskirts of town into like a proper office in the CBD. Had a whole floor of a building, and it was just very exciting. And I just completely fell in love with how technology, and particular sort of digital communication technologies like email, like social media, how that could be involved in helping people change things that they didn't like about their lives and their sort of communities. And I was there for quite a long time until I sort of started feeling a little bit like, I remember having this feeling, and now it feels like such a sort of horrible, immature, conceited thought to have. But I remember distinctly having this thought of being like, I'm 22 and I've met everyone I'm going to meet in this city, of just feeling like the sector was so small, and I'd already gotten the chance to meet everyone in it, and everyone in it was so great. They were just like brilliant, really switched on, clever people. But I was also seeing that the people that I sort of respected the most weren't staying in Sydney. They were moving to London, they were moving to New York. And it felt like, there wasn't really a future for me that looked any different from the life I'd been living. And I didn't think life was supposed to be that easy at 22. So I left, and I went to the UK first on a secondment to 38 Degrees, who is sort of the British equivalent of Get Up, the organisation I was working for there. And that's where I met who would become my next boss, who was Conor O'Loughlin, who worked at an organisation called Crisis Action. I'm going to Ollie, I'm going to pause and take a sip of water because I need to. I've been talking too much already.
No,
And we're
it's
only
good.
10
It's
minutes in.
really good. I'm absorbed. I'm in it. I want to know that. Like, this is awesome.
Well, moved to Crisis Action, who were based in London. So I uprooted my life, didn't know anyone, moved over here to the other side of the world. Only child, broke my parents' heart.
But also from like a beach like place to a city, and like a very harsh city, I think London can be at times.
Yeah, and I moved in January. So the day I actually left Australia, it was 41 degrees. And when I arrived in the UK, it was -2. And I was like, got off the plane. I was like, what have I done? It's not a good decision. I wasn't like that. I was incredibly excited. There were red buses. I was thrilled. But I worked for Crisis Action, who it was a really different challenge, because unlike Get Up, which was all about, making sure that we were known, empowering the brand, telling all of these stories, Crisis Action didn't have any public facing brand whatsoever. It operated completely behind the scenes. It was a coalition building organization that came out of the Iraq War, where the theory was, 1 million people marched and couldn't make a difference. And actually, if there'd been a way for all of these organizations to coordinate their asks, maybe it would have had more of an impact. So Crisis Action was designed on that principle, that we would work behind the scenes with not-for-profits, charities, businesses, individuals, with a view to end the suffering of civilians in conflict in war zones, essentially. So in my time there, I was there for 5 years as well. I got to work on campaigns around Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Israel, Gaza, a whole bunch of different areas. I got to travel the world. I got to work out of not only London, but Paris, Brussels, New York, DC, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Beirut. Just had an incredible time. And instead of creating my own sort of communications, it was my responsibility to think about how we could create sort of innovative campaigns using technology that would be worked on by a range of organizations. So not only did I have to sort of come up with the campaigns, but then I had to convince organizations like Save the Children, Oxfam, Amnesty International, all the way down to, the last individual surgeons operating out of Aleppo in Syria, to collaborate on these sort of campaigns. And that, again, was a amazing opportunity, and just some of the most incredible campaigning and work I've ever been a part of. Nothing feels more important than that. But it also really introduced me to the limits of campaigning and the limits of technology. At the time, Russia had just gotten involved in the war in Syria, and had really, really sort of turned things around and been really horrible for civilians. And one of the challenges that sort of I would face every day at work was, how do I stop Putin from bombing hospitals? And it just felt like none of the tools in my arsenal were good enough to face that challenge. And obviously, not long after I left Crisis Action, Russia invaded Ukraine, and we've seen this massive escalation in what's going on in Israel and Palestine now. And it's I feel really grateful that that there are people who are thinking about those challenges, but that my time in that space is over, because it really was grueling and made me much more of a cynic than I would have been otherwise. But I definitely got to a point after 5 years at Crisis Action. It was very different to relate. I was one of the longest serving staff members. People tend to cycle through those organizations quite quickly when you're working on humanitarian issues and war and conflict in general. I really wanted to work on something that felt closer to home, that grounded me in the place that I was in a bit more, which is the UK, but also where the sort of difference that I was working towards was much more visible and measurable than the sort of work I was doing in trying to improve the lives of civilians in war zones. And that's when I went to Relate. So thinking about again, how to use the internet, how to use technology, how to use digital tools to improve people's relationships that they have with themselves and their families and their friends and their partners. And I don't know if you were expecting a 15-minute, introduction to my life, but that's what you've ended up with.
But I think it's brilliant because you really have. Do you know what though? The common thread though is you've always had that positive impact, and you have always been an advocate for technology. And certainly, and I'm going to be really transparent to those listening today, but Sarah actually attended, or you've attended 2 of our roundtables now, very much focused on data. And I think what is clear, or certainly one of my observations about Sarah, was just how you really have used technology, and you continue to use technology to its strengths, and you're not afraid of using new technology. And I think certainly in the for good space, there's we have quite a few challenges. People's expertise and knowledge of new technology, and the nervousness around using it, and that's everywhere. But I think certainly in the for good space, in the not for profit space, it's more apparent. I think it's fair to say that. I can see you nodding your head, Sarah, but I don't want to speak on your behalf. But I just think it really struck me when you were talking, and some of the examples that you've spoken about previously, Sarah. I was just like in awe of the fact that you have a really good grounded approach to using technology, and you're not afraid to experiment and try new things. And I think that might lead us on to the next question, which I have for you, which is, can you talk to us about an example of tech for good that you're using in Relate at the moment, or maybe you're about to use? Do you have one example that you can share with us today?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So one of the things that we're working on at the moment that I'm really excited by is a project that's being very generously funded by the Department for Work and Pensions here in the UK, and it's a campaign where we're looking to sort of improve the ways that parents who are going through a separation or divorce can relate to one another, interact with each other, and co-parent. And we're actually using like a lot of organizations at the moment using AI to sort of look at this, and it's one of those it's an area that's moving so fast that when we put this pitch forward, it felt like what we were suggesting was completely novel and not in use anywhere. And now that we're sort of 6 months later, I think it's becoming not commonplace by any means, but it's less of an out there idea. So what we're looking at the moment, one of the things that we found is that, and this is across the board at Relate, not necessarily just when we're thinking about what we call reducing parental conflict, which is basically helping parents who aren't together anymore actually get along and focus on raising their kid. One of the things that we've really noticed is that the times when people most need support, times when we're not available. So we're not a crisis response service, so we don't have phone lines that are operating 24 hours a day. But when we see real spikes in people booking relationship counselling or people looking on our website, is sort of between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. Which feels quite strange, but actually when I think about the times when my relationships haven't been working very well, that's exactly the point when you've had this big fight, you've finally someone stormed out or gone to bed and slammed the door or done something along those lines, and you can't fall asleep because you're so stressed about this horrible argument that you've just had, and you turn to Google to try and resolve that. And because we're not a crisis response service, we're not going to be having telephones sort of manned and womaned or personed 24 hours a day. We wanted to think about how it was that we could provide accessible and useful support at those times. And where we've sort of landed in our most recent part is creating a chatbot that is available to parents who are sort of struggling, that they can talk to, that is trained entirely on our years and years worth of guidance, advice, articles, service specifications, the syllabus and information that our counsellors themselves are trained on when they go through our training courses, that will allow people to be able to access the advice that will hopefully sort of be useful to them to get them through those particular moments until it is that they can find time to make a follow-up plan. And at its most basic level, that's what this project is about. But we've also got a few other things that it does that we think are going to be useful. So one of those is it's a writing editor, and this is all being made currently. It's none of this is operational right now, unfortunately, but will be soon. One of them is a writing editor. So let's say you've separated from your partner and it's their turn to have the kid this weekend, and they've just messaged you and said that someone's come up at work and they can't take your kid, and this is the 6th time that that's happened, and you're I'm trying to watch my language during this this podcast, but you're really annoyed about that, and you want to write a message that expresses that you're really annoyed, but you want to do it in a way that is not going to escalate things and make things worse. So you can draft your message in this sort of tool, and it will give you advice and point out where how you've said this might make someone feel attacked. Can we suggest you say it in this way instead? To sort of give people pause and think about how they might say things differently. Another sort of function of that editor is it's you can ask it to act as your child. So you can give it some information. My child is 7 years old and neurodivergent, and generally quite worried. I want to explain to them that we're separating, and you can practice on that with giving that the sort of bot those parameters that it will come back and sort of tell you, what the child might be thinking, feeling, what questions that they might have, so you can have a go at having those conversations a few times in a safe space before you actually have to have that conversation with your child.
It's like scenario, like helping you work through different scenarios, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think this is brilliant for many different reasons, but the one thing that struck me, like hearing this is this is a really good use case for using AI and it actually having a positive impact and really helping people work through. It's what you've done, and I'm giving a little bit away here, and I said I wouldn't do this, but obviously we've had a couple of round tables on data. But I think the way that you've surfaced the data in terms of understanding when people need access the most, or when they're most likely to try and book an appointment or go and seek help, is outside of working hours, which it makes total sense to me. I can relate to that. Like, if I've had an argument with my husband, or my kids have driven me potty, or I'm having a really tough time of it, it's when I've had that downtime post working and post put my kids to bed, and my brain has time to think about these things and process things. It's at that point where I'm like, if I need help, I'm most likely to ask for help or to go and seek help at that time. And it is always tends to be, certainly for me, going to be outside of working hours. So that makes sense. And the fact that you were able to surface that data is brilliant, because then you've injected that into a incredible solution, which is this chatbot, right? Which will enable you to scale, I guess, as well, because you're going to be able to hopefully help more people outside of working hours, so that people can get the help when they most need it, which is brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me, I don't know, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but were your organisation on board with doing something with AI, or was there a lot of nervousness or some opinions around using it?
Yeah. the organization was surprisingly really, really on board. You know, I was brought in a digital transformation role originally to Relate, and I've moved into my role now. And Relate has always been, you know, aware that then sort of behind the times when it comes to adopting digital. They were sort of, all of their services were delivered face to face before COVID, and then all of their services were delivered virtually during and post COVID. They had to make a really quick change. But they're also incredibly curious, just a really curious collection of people who are very motivated by the cause, which is how can we support as many people with their relationships as possible. But also, you know, the safety of our clients is really the most important thing. And, you know, when you think about relationship support, you know, that ranges from everything from like a group of people living in a share house who just can't figure out whose turn it is to wash the dishes to, you know, some of the more serious things that you might come across, which is where there is a serious crime or, you know, a murder committed because of violence within a relationship. And we don't work with, we're not a crisis response center. We tend to, generally speaking, if there's abuse in a relationship, then it's except in very specific circumstances, we'll refer to specialist services. But it means that we have to be really careful to make sure that the people who are coming to access our services are people who we're in the best place to actually support and help. And that was one of the things that was really important to the team, was what's the safeguarding look like with using a tool like this? Because the last thing you want is someone to be saying, you know, I'm scared of what my partner's going to do to me when it gets home, and have that bot sort of say, well, have you considered talking to them about your feelings using I not you statements? Because, you know, that's not going to happen if someone is scared. And one of the really ingenious ways that we've dealt with this, we're working with an agency called IE Digital on building this, and I really rate them. They're really great. But one of the things that they have developed is a secondary bot that interacts with our public facing one that operates completely behind the scenes, which takes every message that's sent to it and then does a evaluation on what the percentage likelihood that someone is at risk of harm based on the message that they've received. And then we're able to put in sort of trigger points that react at, you know, 25%, 50%, 75%, that trigger different safeguarding policies or responses. So, you know, if someone says, I'm worried about how my partner might react, you know, that might trigger a sort of a soft response, and goes, you know, it might say, oh, well, what makes you worry? And they say, you know, well, something like this hasn't happened before. That will de-escalate the response. But if they say the last time they punched a hole in the wall, that will greatly sort of escalate, and we can make sure that we've got sort of nuanced response based on the inputs in that regard. And making sure that we're sort of, you know, if someone's coming in and it looks like they're at immediate risk, then that can be flagged to the people that it needs to be flagged to, and they can be told to get in touch with people who can provide them with support in that time. But also making sure that we have the ability to sort of get in touch with them the next day and do a welfare check, and if there's something that's been worrying, that we can see it and act on it.
It's brilliant, and that safeguarding piece is amazing. And I really hope for anyone listening that is maybe thinking or doing something in this space, that is a really good takeaway for you. If you can expand on that safeguarding piece, it sounds like you guys have handled that brilliantly. And I guess, you know, you said it at the start, but this space, AI, like everything is moving at such a pace now. I feel like every week there's something, and I can't, you know, I struggle to keep up with it, and I rely very heavily on the team to help guide me and help showcase examples of where it might be useful and where there have been big changes. And actually that collective effort has really helped us all, I think, progress forwards. But would you have any advice for anyone listening today trying to tackle something in the AI space? Let's say they're coming up, there's an AI solution that they're thinking about that they probably haven't got off the ground yet. Do you have any advice that you could share? And I should share that I've probably put Sarah, I know I've put Sarah on the spot here, so don't worry if you don't, but if you do, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that's been a useful guiding point is just to imagine how it might work, and then not let things stop at the first hurdle. So there's a real, a different approach to how this could have been taken at Relay. Is someone could have suggested this, and someone could have said, but what happens when someone comes on and says, I'm worried my partner's gonna kill me, and then what are we going to do? And a response to that might have been, yeah, you're right, like that original concept that we've come up with won't work in that scenario, so we just shouldn't do this at all. Instead, we've gone, okay, well, what would you want it to do in that scenario? And then tried to find a way to make that work. So instead of looking at those sort of hurdles that you will face and that you'll face when you come across any sort of new technology, thinking about not for reasons not to do it, but for ways that you can then overcome those hurdles. And I think it sounds like a really small difference, but actually, culturally speaking, it's the organizations that are really good at identifying what are reasons not to do this or what are reasons that can go wrong. And rather than using that as a justification not to proceed, thinking about, okay, well, how do we mitigate that? One of the exercises that we always used to take part in at Crisis Action, which is something I've taken with me moving forward, is the idea of a pre-mortem, which is kind of a morbid way of thinking about it, actually, but you do end up quite morbid in these things of like, instead of doing the post-mortem, once something has died and figuring out what's gone wrong, having a really creative and imaginary space before the event or the project takes place and goes, let's imagine everything that we think could go wrong here and why, and what can we do now to stop that from happening. And it's a really good way. It's a really good way to come up with those sort of like outlier events and have a mitigation strategy for them. It's amazing if you're dealing with any sort of governance structure of being able to come to a board and say, here's my very long list of risks and mitigations that I've come up with. But also it's an amazing cultural tool of giving people space to voice their concerns or worries about a project. Because often, especially if it's something new and exciting, people don't want to be the one that, poo-poos the innovative idea. But if you make the point of success, like where could this go wrong? The most interesting pre-mortems I've been involved in is when you get in there and there's silence for 5 minutes and someone goes, I'm worried about this thing. And then everyone goes, yeah, me too. And you're like, oh, there's been this undercurrent of fear about this thing. Here's this opportunity, on the one hand, best case scenario, there's an opportunity to like nip that in the bud and resolve it. Worst case scenario, still a best case scenario. You might uncover a reason not to do something and save yourself, because not everything should go ahead. Yeah. There are sort of bad ideas. And, Edison's way of 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb or whatever it is, like those are learnings and they're useful pieces of information as well. And that sort of cultural space is a really good way of, instead of moving fast and breaking things, of moving fast but also making sure that you don't break things and that good stuff is made.
I think that's brilliant, and I'm definitely straight away going to go back to my team and talk about the concept of a pre-mortem. I don't think I haven't heard that phrase before, but I think we do something similar. We have a workshop where you're looking at kind of like what can go wrong, but I've not heard that phrase. So that is excellent, and I think a really good takeaway for people. But I also love the fact that you're not just thinking about the risks there. It's the culture piece where you're taking people along the journey, you're telling the story with them and you're involving them. And I think that's a really powerful way of working internally in organizations. I think you have to work like that when you're dealing with new technologies and to be honest, so many unknowns. So I have a question. This chatbot, is it live yet?
No, not yet. We're still, so we've we've got the functionality. So we've tested it and tested it and tested it. Had a bunch of people come in and try and break it and try and make it say ridiculous things. We're just in the sort of design and build stage at the moment for making it go live. It's due to go live in Q1 of 20. So the sort of April time is when we're hoping it'll be available to the public to use.
Which is amazing. And I guess my assumption would be, look, whenever you go live with something, it will never be absolutely perfect. So you'll put it live and then you'll get insights and learnings and data to be able to make informed decisions as you push that forwards, right? Is that right?
Exactly. And that's the idea. And we're hoping one of the things that we're hoping we'll be able to do with this is take the technology and potentially sell it on to others who might want to be able to use something like that, particularly local authorities who will offer up reducing parental conflict programs, which as a charity becomes a good revenue generation sort of option for us. But also for us, it's something that we'd love to expand out. One of the things that we're constantly dealing with right now is primarily the way that we offer relationship support is through counselling. And counselling is such a resource intensive mode of support because, for every one person or for every couple, or, we work with multi-partnered people as well, but any sort of collective that's coming in, you have one counsellor working with them. And it's, you've also got the administration team who's got that in, you've got the finance department, the HR department, the marketing department, all of these those sort of connected overheads. And it's very difficult to, at the same time, pay your team what you want to be paying them, whilst also keeping the costs down. And if we can find a way to obviously not replace that, because there's nothing that can replace that one-on-one counselling, but be able to provide a low cost or free accessible version for people to be able to bounce off something that, can offer, is trained on the same material and can offer some guidance and something there. For most people, just having someone to sit and listen, even if that isn't a real person, but it's someone who's voicing those things, can be really useful. And for us, it's a great way to give people some sort of preliminary support, particularly in those out of hours times before they access something a little bit more hands-on and personal.
So I think that's incredibly entrepreneurial of the organisation, but also really smart. So some people have been known to term this, and there's lots of different definitions of this, I should flag, but sustainable development. So designing and building a solution that can be repurposed for other similar type use cases. And I think that's a really smart way of working. And I know, there are organizations like WRI, so World Resources Institute, based in the US. They're really good at that. And literally any digital tool that they design and build now, they are always thinking about other use cases of how it could be repurposed. So I think that's brilliant that you're doing that. And it is entrepreneurial in terms of thinking about what other revenue that could bring to the organization, because that's going to help push you guys forwards to achieve what you need to achieve. So that's awesome. Oh my gosh, double whammy that you get to utilize new technology, but also potentially be able to repurpose it for other organizations that might be trying to achieve a similar type thing, which is brilliant. Right. Okay, that was an awesome example. But my question to you, Sarah, next is, are there any other examples that you would want to shine a light on today that perhaps maybe inspire you or have caught your eye?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of examples for this. My sort of go-to one that's always my favorite one is one that was done by a Spanish organization that was done around displaying messages to children who might be victims of abuse. So they brought up all of this billboards advertising. The organization's called Aid to Children and Adolescents. They brought up all this billboard advertising. And if you were over 4'5", you would just see a normal sort of advertisement. But if you were a child who was under 4'5" and was looking up at the billboard from that angle, you would see a message about how to access support if you were being abused or getting someone was hurting you, it was using a sort of lenticular lens, it's called, but this sort of technology that, if you look at something from one direction, you see one thing, and another one you see that, to make sure that children were able to know what to do if they were sort of in trouble in that regard, which I just thought was so clever. And I sort of love things like this that exist in the public space and public realm as well. So I thought that was great. Another one that I've been really inspired by recently is RNIB's Sonic logo that they've introduced as a sort of accessibility tool. So this idea that it's the Royal National Institute of Blind People, to avoid using sort of acronyms. But obviously their key audience is sight impaired and sort of visually impaired. So they've worked on creating a logo that is sonic, that is sound, so that their audiences can hear a representation of who they are as an organization, and have a series of sort of like brand sounds as well as brand images and brand colors and different things like that, to really make their brand sing in this creative way, in the same way a visual logo would for people who could see and engage with things in that way, which I think is just incredibly audience driven, and just a really lovely way of creating connection, and just sort of thinking outside of the the campaigns that I love the most are those that sort of think about why is this thing important, and go back to the real beginning of that why. And this one is just like, it's really important for our audience to connect with us and to associate us with things. So when they see something out in the wild, they know it's us, and they've thought, well, if we can't do that with visuals, what else can we do it with? And leading into sound in that way, I just think is a really lovely approach.
It's brilliant. And when you say it out loud, it's almost like, well, why now? Like, this should have been the case all along. But that's a lovely example. And I hadn't heard that before. So I'm definitely going to go away and have a look at that. And that just made me think of something that I came across really randomly this weekend, in that every dolphin, because this is really down a rabbit hole now, but they communicate through sounds, and they have different sounds which are their own signature sounds, which are, I guess it's kind of like
a voice,
it's like that's their signature, which is what RNIB are doing. Like, it's brilliant. Oh my God.
Yeah.
And so is this a new thing, or have they been doing this for a while? Do you know, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it launched at the end of last year. So it is really new. Yeah. And I haven't seen any sort of, user feedback or impact results or anything along those lines. But I don't know, it just the internet is such an inaccessible place most of the time. We're trying to get much better, particularly at using sort of screen readers to go through everything we do and audit it and make sure that it works. And sometimes you go onto websites and you access them through a screen reader. That's just such a horrible experience. Nothing makes sense. Everything is convoluted and confusing, and it's not useful or intelligible, let alone enjoyable or pleasant. And I just love the idea that there's an organization out there that is working hard to do that. And right now it's an outlier, but it's exactly the kind of thing that I can see in 10 years that everyone has, as part of this very necessary movement to making all of our work more accessible.
Do you know what? I don't even think it'll be 10 years. I think it might be quicker than that. And I think the way that technology's changing and evolving at such a rate right now, I do think it'll be sooner. I think it'll be more like 5 years. But again, it'll be interesting to see what it actually is.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want to go back. So this incredible chatbot that you're looking to hopefully have ready in April time-ish, it would be amazing to get you back to talk about how, like, what you've learned going through that journey and what insights you've kind of ascertained, and how you'll be pushing that forward. So expect an invite back soon, Sarah, in your inbox, because post-April I am going to be hunting you down to understand how it's worked and how it's progressed. And for anyone
Absolutely.
for anyone listening today, if you do have any questions or you want to know more, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, puff@threesidedcube.com, and I will see if I can hook you up with Sarah, who could probably talk in more detail about the solution that they're putting in place very, very soon. But Sarah, look, it's been amazing. Thank you so much. We've been talking. Do you know, I could carry on talking, and I must admit, I am a fan of your accent as well. So that
Oh, thank you.
Look, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being so honest and transparent in terms of what you're up to at Relate, and for sharing those incredible examples. The lenticular example, it's basically different perspectives, isn't it? It's just
Exactly.
so clever. So thank you for sharing those examples. And yeah, thanks for listening, guys.